We're here in the lobby of the Scotia Bank Center for the Fatima Center's conference, Fatima, the Path to Peace, and I have the honor and privilege of sitting here with Joe Scheidler, the most intrepid warrior for the pro-life cause, I would say, in the history of the pro-life movement. Thank you for being with us, Joe, and speaking with us regarding this conference and other subjects.
I love exaggeration.
No, it's true. I mean, as a pro-life attorney down in the trenches of the pro-life defense movement, I can attest to the fact that there's no one who's been more courageous in the fight for life in America, protection of unborn children in the womb, than you have been. And for your labors, you've been labeled a terrorist.
Terrorist and racketeer, a convicted racketeer. Yeah, that came out of the Now versus Scheidler.
Now versus Scheidler is a landmark Supreme Court decision in which, amazingly enough, we have an agreement by both the liberal and conservative wings of the court that RICO, the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, was misapplied to you and your activities. Maybe you could give us a brief explanation of that legal saga which dragged on for how many years?
Well, it's still not finished. It's still not finished because we have not gotten our damages, $64,000, which were approved by the court, and now has appealed again. So the case really isn't truly over, although the racketeer charges are dismissed.
You prevailed on the merits. The Supreme Court said that what you did was not racketeering because what you did was not designed to extort money or to commit the crime of extortion, but merely to express a point of view. And the fact that someone might be deterred legally by your advocacy from obtaining an abortion did not amount to extortion. That should have been a no-brainer. Yet how long did this case drag on?
Well, you know, it started in 1986. I was picketing a pro-abortion gathering out in Kansas when I was served and notified that I was being sued by the National Organization for Women. But we went to court. Nothing happened for a long time. So we had to go to court to see if racketeering could be used against our movement. And the court ruled 9-0 that it could be used. Then they waited another 4 or 5 years until the 90s, and then the trial began. And it was a 7-week trial in Chicago on racketeering, and the jury of 6 found us guilty. But you know, the abortionists could bring in anybody they wanted. They aren't too concerned about telling the truth. And so it was really a fake trial, and yet the jury, 5 of whom had left, it was a 6-man jury, 5 had already quit, and they had 5 alternates take their place. They ruled 6-0 against us, and so then we had to appeal.
That's amazing. That and the irony of it is almost unbearable when you think about it. You're put on trial for racketeering, and the so-called victims of the racketeering are people who kill human beings for a living.
Yes.
What has happened to America?
Well, that's what we thought all the way through it. It was a joke, really, and the idea that we were there at these places to save life, which is supposed to be a very plus, you know, to save life. If a fireman saves someone from a fire, he's given honor, given a medal and so on. We were there to save lives, and we did save lives. Many lives. Many women did not go through with their abortions because we were there to give them information that they didn't have, which the abortionists would not give them. And so we were doing a good thing, morally good. We did nothing that was really a crime. We didn't. My organization is committed to peaceful activities. And it was the Pro-Life Action League that they were after, and then some other pro-lifers. And for a while they included many, many women, all of whom they dropped. They wanted it to be a man-woman battle. That was obvious because Monica Miller had been in, Joan Andrews had been in, and they were dropped. So the crimes were non-existent, but they would have us yelling and shouting and doing things that didn't look good, but they never came up with a real crime.
Yelling and shouting in the context of a political protest, that's as American as apple pie.
You'd think so.
I mean, that's life in the big city.
Unless you're shouting life yes, abortion no.
Well, in my experience as a pro-life defense attorney, I find that exaggerated depictions of protected conduct are basically the staple of the abortion industry.
Yes.
When they attempt to get injunctions imposed on pro-life activists, it's always the same thing. He was yelling at me. He was walking near me.
Right.
He kept offering me literature that I didn't want. Hello, that's called First Amendment protected activity.
Exactly.
But in the abortion context, this becomes something that a federal court can issue an injunction prohibiting under pain of incarceration for contempt of court.
Right, and that's what they did. They came up with the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrance Bill, FACE, and of course it carries heavy penalties, financial and time served and so on. And so they really knocked a lot of wind out of the activist movement, but we still are able to save a lot of women. Because basically, since we weren't committing those crimes anyway, we're still not committing them. And so we still have a great deal of freedom to save babies and save their mothers from abortion.
What were the kinds of things that you were accused of doing in the Now versus Scheidler litigation that the Supreme Court unanimously determined at the end of this torturous process were not extortion? What were you involved in?
We were involved mainly in, well, going where the abortions take place. That's the logical thing that a pro-lifer would do, at the abortion mills. We would go up to the women going in and ask them if they wanted to discuss this, if they had thought it out clearly, if they would take our literature. Now, there were times when we had sit-ins in those days, when we would go into the clinic, and while we were there, abortions could not be performed. We had held some of those.
Well, again, the sit-in is an American institution.
Right.
The civil rights movement in the 1960s was fueled by the sit-in. And to constitute a sit-in, it's basically political theater, a traditional form of American protest, as extortion is preposterous. And the Supreme Court ultimately agreed with you, did it not?
Yes, they did. We knew, actually, you could tell at both of our appearances before the Supreme Court, because we had to go twice on the same case, that the abortionists were not doing too well because of the questions that were asked. Even Ruth Bader Ginsburg asked something about then Martin Luther King would have been a racketeer.
Exactly.
And that sort of gave us a clue that the court was siding with us. That we won both times in the Supreme Court, 8-1 the first time, and then the second time 8-0, because one of the justices had not heard the evidence and was not allowed to vote.
That is an absolutely remarkable victory, and I have to think that there was some element of divine intervention, because we've seen so much result-oriented jurisprudence at all levels of the judicial system, state and federal, to get that kind of a win from the Supreme Court. Number one, you had superb attorneys.
Right.
That's a given. But even with the best of attorneys, that result in the pro-life context is nothing short of miraculous as far as I can see.
Yes.
You got a tremendous result there. Joe, you mentioned Martin Luther King, and I was stunned when I read for the first time many years ago his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. And in that letter, which he wrote when he was incarcerated for engaging in political protest, not unlike what you do on behalf of the unborn, he cites St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine for the proposition that an unjust and immoral law is no law at all. And I have to say, he sounded more Catholic in the letter from the Birmingham jail than many members of the church hierarchy today, who seem to be cowering in fear of the civil authorities.
You know, my attorney, Tom Brecka, who heads up the Thomas More law firm in Chicago, refers to the letter from the Birmingham jail all the time, because it is, Martin Luther King was well read. And in fact, I marched with Dr. King. Remember the Selma to Montgomery march, where they ended up in Montgomery, Alabama? And I took a group of students. I was teaching at Mundelein College in Chicago, and I took a group of students down with a chaperone, and some of the nuns went along, and got in on the tail end of that march. And of course, it was his famous talk there in Montgomery, too, to the crowds sitting on the sidewalk. But they had warned us. I had gone into Montgomery from the St. Jude's camp where we were all staying, and I was a reporter after college. I took journalism and worked for the South Bend Tribune for a while, so I liked to get both sides and really see what the mix was. I was walking into Montgomery when I was surrounded by a group of Southern gentlemen who came out of a bar with rocks, and they asked me what I was doing there. I had red mud on my shoes, if I had been in the march, and I said, well, just the end of it. And I was trying, I could almost hear the cock crow in the background. I was denouncing, but I was scared. I was worried. And fortunately, someone in the group of men there knew that there was going to be trouble. So he very graciously told the men that he would set them up in the bar if they'd go back in. So they did, all but one. And then he told me very clearly, go back to the encampment and stay with the crowd because there's going to be trouble. And certainly there was trouble. People trying to leave Montgomery to go back north had no road signs. They'd covered the road signs with sacks. And you could go maybe in town, go your tire a little bit over the walk line, and you could be arrested. And if you took a paper out of the kiosk, it would say you stole 3 or 4. All kind of minor aggravations were visited upon people who had come down from the north. And that night we heard that Viola Liuzzo from Michigan was shot and killed on her way back to Selma. And her passenger did escape. But these were scary times. And they were a portent, I think, of what's happening in our society. Right and wrong don't seem to make much difference anymore. It's what you want to make right, what you want to make wrong. Abortion, there couldn't be anything worse than taking the life of an innocent child, and yet it's the law of the land, and you get arrested for trying to save a child from abortion.
That's a diabolical inversion of the proper order of things, and we find ourselves in a situation now where organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which ironically was involved in a good way in the civil rights struggle back in the 60s, have been perverted into precisely what they profess to condemn, an organization of intolerance that tries to repress people who are standing up for the law of God. That's what the civil rights movement was all about, resistance to unjust laws, attempting to treat a class of human beings as subhuman.
Well, Morris Dee's group was the first law firm that now used against us in the antitrust case. And the Southern Poverty Law Center was there for 1 year, and they lost the case, and they saw that it was not a good case, and they didn't stay with them. When they went on into racketeering, actually added racketeering to the other, the Southern Poverty Law Center dropped out.
That's really something. You were involved in that civil rights march for the rights of African Americans. The organization that was supposedly dedicated to that cause ends up trying to sue you for standing up for the rights of unborn children, who, I would add, are in the same position in the womb that African Americans were at the time of the Dred Scott decision.
Yes.
One of the most atrocious judicial decisions in the history of America, which basically held that by definition, African Americans were an inferior class of beings who would have only such rights as were accorded to them by the white majority.
Right.
And Justice Tawney said, I might not like this, but that's the law of the land, my hands are tied, go amend the Constitution. That's the situation you're in now.
That is. And
abortion is a constitutional right.
Right. Yeah, it's been found somewhere in the penumbra of the Constitution that you can kill a baby.
So the parallel between the plight of the unborn and the plight of African Americans is exemplified in the Dred Scott decision is eerily exact. I mean, you have Dred Scott, you have Roe versus Wade. 2 decisions handed down by the Supreme Court taking away the fundamental rights of an entire class of human beings. Only in the case of abortion, we're talking about what now? Upwards of 50 million people
probably 57
murdered by state sanction. So you're still involved in this pro-life activity.
Yes.
And the organization, you said, has actually recovered $64,000 in costs from now,
yes,
having prevailed in the United States Supreme Court. Where do you stand with that cost application?
Well, they challenged it immediately. Now, the courts have gone over this carefully, very carefully, for years, and have come down measuring every penny, every expense, and they've come up with 64,000 something odd dollars. It's being appealed, and undoubtedly, eventually, it'll come back to us, but I don't know if I'll live to ever see the 64,000. It would go to the Pro-Life Action League, and we could use it.
Well, you're out from under the original judgment, though.
Yes.
So that's gone, and I understand there were liens on your personal property and your real estate, and those
Our
are gone.
house, yes, we had to put our house up in escrow. We didn't own our home, which was an inconvenience because you couldn't do any remodeling, any repair. You were sort of stuck with that, but we have it back. We fixed it up and put an addition on, and so.
Well, you know, let's talk a little bit more about this organization, the Southern Poverty Law Center. You're probably well familiar with the fact that they've labeled you a domestic terrorist. And what do you say in response to the activities of organizations like this? What can we do to oppose them?
Well, they'll fade out in time. I think that when the country comes back to its senses, when we get rid of abortion on demand and gay marriage and things like that, I think that these organizations will peter out. Look at, for instance, the National Organization for Women. They were power. When they sued us, they were a powerful organization. What do you hear about them now? And now, I don't even know if they have $64,000 to give us if we win the settlement.
Well, that's good news, actually.
Yeah, they do. They wear out. Their time has come and gone, and I think that's what will happen. Or they will revert to protecting the just.
You know, you've indicated in these remarks you've just made optimism for the future, and this conference is about a prophecy that could not be more optimistic about its ultimate outcome. As Our Lady of Fatima said, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, which will be converted. A period of peace will be granted to the world. What do you see for the future of the pro-life movement in America and the moral climate in America in light of the message of Fatima? How do you think the two are related?
Well, you know, I am a cockeyed optimist. Ultimately, Mary wins, Christ wins, good prevails. We know that. We're going through a critical time now, a testing time for a lot of people. It may be a time of a form of martyrdom for many. It is in other countries, certainly, and may come to America, to Canada. So, but I see so many good things happening. I see so many young people that are inspired by the church, by the basic teachings of the church. Homeschoolers now. In my own family, a number of my grandchildren are getting the religion that we got way back in the 30s and 40s, the truth. And so I talked to an interviewer the other day. They have Blackstone Productions. They do a Christian, it's a Catholic organization. And I asked the young man, what's your goal? And he says, my goal is to make God likable, to make people like God. And I thought, what an ambition, to bring God, not just to judge, and so on, but to bring God into people's homes, into their hearts. And I thought that was such a wonderful thing to say, to make people like God. And I see so much of that. And also, abortion is becoming a very pejorative term. We're seeing now that the majority of people do not want to be identified with abortion. They may still say, well, Roe v. Wade ought to stay, but they don't know what Roe v. Wade said anyway. They don't know it's abortion on demand for the full term of pregnancy. Almost everyone is against late-term abortions for, so many reasons. And so people are getting educated, and the young people, I see a new spirit. So I think the more we depend the more optimistic we are about our youth and our future, the things are going to clear up. They'll never be perfect. We're always a fallen race. There is always a satanic power, and there are going to be bad people. But I don't say that we'll be finished. When we started on abortion, fighting abortion, we thought it would be maybe a year, maybe 5 years, maybe 10. We never thought 40. Now I'm at the point where I don't know if it's ever possible to get a constitutional amendment to outlaw abortion, but I think people will ultimately become so disenamored of that as a solution that they'll find that doctors won't want to do abortions. They're now trying to get nurses and attendants who don't have medical degrees to do abortions because doctors are dropping out like flies.
That's wonderful news, and I think it indicates that there's a wild card that the enemies of life really can't account for, and that's the operation of God's grace.
Right.
Christ is the Lord of history. Grace will ultimately prevail. But here, let's touch on a delicate subject, but I think it's one that we ought to discuss. I've always said that the church has the power to remake the face of the earth with amazing rapidity if only it regains its militancy. And here the delicate subject is, why has the hierarchy failed to lead the charge in a peaceful, nonviolent way, a la the civil rights movement of the 60s, in favor of the protection of life in the womb? It seems to me that if the hierarchy led a civil rights movement of that sort for unborn children, legalized abortion would not last a year in this country or in America.
I've always said if the bishops had gotten together, when they read Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, saw what the government had done, if they had said to the Catholic population and any Christians that want to come along, or anyone who wants to come along, don't pay any taxes, no more federal taxes until this is over, is turned around. If they could have done something powerful like that, and people would have listened to that, and a lot of people would have joined us, what could the government have done? But they were mousy about it. I went to the Archdiocese in Chicago when I read Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, thinking the church will be the leader to fight abortion. And I sat there and listened to the priest who was in charge of respect for life, not abortion, respect for life, general. He said, "Mr. Scheidler, you are too ambitious. You're in too much of a hurry to work with the church." And he said, "I think it would be better if you were on your own." And I said, "Father, that may be some of the best advice I've ever gotten." So I let it go at that. I did go to the bishops' conventions and put up signs and posters. I put up a stage with the picture of the baby on the cross and tried all kind of things. I remember at the one conference I used to meet in Chicago, we're going to the one out in Baltimore and talk to the bishops there. I don't know why. I think there was a kind of a lassitude. Things are just going along, and let's keep them going along, and let's don't make waves. I've talked to so many bishops. In fact, my uncle was Bishop Percy of Fort Wayne South Bend. He helped me greatly in getting started. And my cousin was the bishop of in Amarillo, Texas, the Bishop Chapey, my cousin. And so I had bishops in the family. And one of my bishops said, and I hate to say this, but he said he thought many of the bishops had lost the faith. And I didn't know what he meant exactly, but I've heard since then that the faith that we really, the church militant, was not the church militant. You know, we have the church triumphant. We hope someday we have the church suffering, that's us. But the church militant, the fighting church, had really sort of disappeared and was not ready when the crisis came.
And our Lord Himself says that if the salt loses its savor, it will be trampled underfoot.
And much we've been trampled.
And the thing about it that is so perplexing and so frustrating is that the hierarchy, the church militant, is holding the key to its own jail cell.
Right.
It's almost a self-imposed imprisonment. There's nothing to prevent them from breaking out of their self-imposed confinement, taking to the public square, and saying as Martin Luther King said, but this time with respect to the unborn, we shall overcome.
Right.
March with us, 10,000 strong, 100,000 strong.
Well, some have come out and joined us.
There are noble exceptions,
and
of course.
I have to say, when Cardinal George came to Chicago, he led us in a 1,000-man march to an abortion mill. And it was interesting because he was leading the rosary, and the pro-aborts were really screaming and yelling and drowning him out. And so he just said, we will say it all in unison. So 1,000 some led and followed, and the pro-aborts were drowned out. It was kind of a nice little twist.
That's the perfect note on which to end the interview, because in the end, the intercession of Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady under all of her other titles, will bring down upon us the graces that will right this wrong and end this madness once and for all. Thank you for the honor of this interview.
It's been a real
Mr.
pleasure.
Scheidler, and I'm really glad you were able to make this conference and add your dignified appearance to it. Thanks so much.
Go fight.
In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it.